But I'm certainly in the camp that says, hey, there's something that is unique and special about the operations of this fatty mass of tissue inside your skull that gives rise to the conscious experience and gives rise to the mind. They're deeply related, but nonetheless, they're distinct.
Welcome back to the Modern Sage podcast. I'm Leah Guy, your host. And as always, I'm so happy that you're here. If you're enjoying the podcast or feeling inspired and learning great things, I just ask that you leave a review or a rating or share the podcast with your friends. You can also find the podcast on YouTube, on my YouTube channel, just searching my name, Leah Guy, or youtube.com/a girl named Guy. These promos and more information will be found on Instagram and Facebook, which is Leah Guy Live is my handle. And as always, you can visit my website, leahguy.com, for previous podcasts, upcoming shows, workshops, books, courses, events, and more. Now today, I always try to bring relevant and great information. Today, we're focusing on the brain, the mind. We're going to have a conversation with a very smart man. And every time I talk to smart people, I feel like I should wear a button down. So I did the best I could here. And we are talking with Dr. Mahncke from BrainHQ. Welcome to the show.
Well, it's my pleasure. Nice to meet you, Leah.
Nice to meet you too. Yeah. Well, I'm pleased to see that your button down is along the same lines as mine, so I don't feel so out of league.
We can both be a little informal. I think that is for the best.
Okay. So I'm going to refer to you as Henry from now on, but those who are watching or listening, you can find all of his information in our show notes and at his website, which will be listed on screen and in the notes. So let's get right to it. You are a neuroscientist, is that correct?
I am. I came out to graduate school to study the brain and unravel the secrets of how the mind and the brain worked and all those kinds of great things.
And how that's been going.
Well, like most people who come to graduate school in neuroscience, you start by thinking you're going to solve the mysteries of consciousness, and you end up deciding you should probably bite off a somewhat smaller piece in order to finish your PhD. But it's been fabulous. This has been an amazing time to study the brain. We're just learning so much about brain science over the past 20 or 30 years. And it's really just deeply changing our concepts of how the brain works and what it can do and what it means for all of us. So it's been a very fun time to be a brain scientist.
I'm sure it is. And especially with the changing times and just the stress on the brain and how we're learning and growing at exponential rates, I would assume. I've got a million questions for you, and I know we can't talk all day, but my interest is primarily in mindfulness. Our audience is very used to us having conversations about mindfulness and consciousness. And I guess to ask a starter question, that's a huge question, is how would you differentiate between the brain, the mind, and consciousness? What's the difference here?
Oh, well, we are just going to dive right into it, aren't we?
Yep.
Well, that is exactly why I came to graduate school. And, scientists have made less progress on that than you might hope. But, here's how I would think about it. The brain is a biological organ, right? It's like your stomach. It's like your liver, right? It's made up of cells and it sits in your skull, and it can be healthy, it can be less healthy. It's fed by your metabolism. We should think about it as a fundamentally an organ of the body, and actually thinking about it in that very concrete, that very non-abstract way, that actually starts to lead us to a lot of insights into brain health, which we can talk about as that comes up. The mind, of course, is the greatest mystery of all, which is, hey, why is it that this 3-pound mass of fatty tissue that sits in your skull, why should that give rise to any sort of experience of the self? And, it didn't have to, is the short answer to that, right? Wow. We can talk about this in more depth as well, but, philosophers and neuroscientists for a long time have generally agreed that, we could probably all get by with our brain functions without any necessarily experience of a mind or a conscious experience. But clearly we have one, and we all have one, right? I have one, you have one. I don't have access to your mind and your conscious experience, but I believe you have one. You don't have to convince me. And so, of course, that continues to be one of the deepest mysteries of neuroscience and psychology and philosophy, is how the brain gives rise to the mind. But I'm certainly in the camp that says, hey, there's something that is unique and special about the operations of this fatty mass of tissue inside your skull that gives rise to the conscious experience and gives rise to the mind. They're deeply related, but nonetheless, they're distinct.
It's so fascinating. And so we don't necessarily need the mind, yet we all have one. And on top of that, so many people have spent their life, at least their adult life, in search of freedom or a higher consciousness or an altered state of this thing that we can't even really identify. What are we
Right.
looking for?
Right. Well, once we have a mind, regardless of whether we needed one, regardless of how it comes out of our brain, once we have a mind and we have a mental operation and we have this, pretty unique ability not only to have a conscious state, but to reflect on our own conscious state. Again, we didn't have to have both, but we do seem to have both, right? We have the sensory experience that comes us into the world that we might call a conscious state. And then when we have the ability to reflect upon ourselves, humans and many animals, we're not unique in this sense. We are all curious and we want to change and affect the world around us to make it more to our liking, right? A beaver comes to a river, and what does a beaver do? It gnaws down a tree and it makes a dam to make a place to live. It changes the environment around it to be more suitable for being a beaver. And I think people do exactly the same things with our minds, right? We have a mind, we reflect on our mental states, and we notice the things that make us happier or less happy about our mental states. And we are just curious little primates. We try to change them and see, well, hey, did I change it for the better? Am I happier now? Did I change it for the worse? Should I not do it that way? But I just think it comes out of that innate curiosity, that innate goal that we all have to change and improve the world around us. And in that case, it includes our minds and our mental states.
Interesting. So from a scientific perspective, or from your perspective, let's just say, would you equate then the mind and consciousness to something spiritual or beyond us? Or do you think it's more of a state of this innate kind of curiosity and our attempts to just get more comfortable or happier?
Yeah. There are many neuroscientists who would say that the mind and the brain are exactly the same thing.
Mhm.
And I am not one of them, although I don't know if I disagree with them as deeply as one might think. As a neuroscientist, I would say the mind is clearly created by the brain. It's very, maybe say a few more words about that in a moment, but we know they're tightly related, right? We know that if you alter the brain, you alter the mind in conscious states, right? You can take a hallucinogen, right? And you're going to think very differently, right? You can take ecstasy and you can fall in love for at least a short period of time. On the other hand, you can damage the brain, right? And there's all kinds of horrible, but as a neuroscientist, fascinating sorts of brain damage that can happen that really deeply affect your mind and your conscious state of yourself. For example, there are people who have damage to parts of the brain that seems to relate to the experience of the body. And they have this very odd situation called alien hand syndrome, where, you might wake up in a hospital and the patient looks down at their own arm and says, hey, that's not my arm, right? I don't believe that's part of my body. And it's clearly connected. No, doctor, that's someone else's arm that's lying there. So, what that tells us is, of course, the brain is deeply related to and creates the mind and mental states. We know that because affecting the brain affects mental states. But of course, it's a two-way street. Our mental states then can affect the brain. So, for example, my mental state might say, hey, I need to get organized today. I need to look at my calendar. I'm going to do this wonderful discussion with Leah today. And that actually affects certain things in my brain, right? That causes my brain to, take certain actions, look up things on my calendar, move upstairs into my living room. So it's very much a two-way street. And so in that sense, I'm the kind of neuroscientist who says, hey, these things are clearly deeply related, but they're also distinct and they have their own domains.
Okay. So how we feel, in other words, whether it's joy or sadness or stress or what have you, has a direct effect on the brain itself. And then the brain also has the effect on our feeling state or awareness and consciousness. Is that what you're
Yeah. Let's take another example about mood, because you mentioned it, right? Something in the world might happen to give me joy, right? I visited my son at college last week, for example, and that was a wonderful, joyful experience. things came in from the outside world. I saw my son, I heard him speak. Those things got processed by auditory and visual centers in my brain. They got integrated with my history with him. That caused the release of certain neurochemicals, and I felt joy. So in that sense, my brain affected my mood. But my mood can then affect my brain, right? All of us have had experiences, for example, like, maybe we felt down and we just wanted to work our way out of that. We just sort of actively said, hey, I'm going to change my thoughts. And that does in fact affect the brain. So it's well established, for example, that psychotherapy, simply the act of talking to a trained psychotherapist, that actually drives changes in brain chemistry, changes in brain structure. And what happens when you talk to a therapist? Well, you talk about what's bugging you and you come up with strategies about how to deal with it. So in that sense, changes in your mental state, changes in your conscious experience, they clearly drive changes in your brain as well. So that's what I mean, that it seems like very much a two-way street to me.
Yeah. It's
And
so fascinating. As I'm hearing you talk, my question to you is, do you walk around constantly thinking about how the brain's functioning? Because I feel like I would if I were you.
well, maybe too much. As it turns out, my wife's actually a neuroscientist as well.
Oh my goodness.
The oldest story in the book, right? You marry the girl in the lab next door.
Yeah.
And at some point, I'll tell you, my son, who I mentioned was in college when he was much younger, we were sitting around the table and talking about something that he had gone wrong at school. And he put his head down. He was like 6 years old. He put his head down on the table and said, "My brain made me do it." And I thought, my wife and I were like, you know what, maybe this is too much neuroscience around the dinner table. We should back off on this a little bit.
Oh, that's funny.
So, yeah.
Well, so the physical parts about the brain, I've often had the experience, I'm sure many people have, of where you feel like the brain actually hurts, that, whether you're overwhelmed or stressed or fatigued, or it's different than a headache. It just kind of feels like your brain hurts. Is that possible, or is this something that we make up?
It's, people talk about my soul aches, right, in certain situations, right? And hey, you're never going to hear me say that people make things like this up. I take people's reports of their mental experiences, their conscious experiences, quite seriously. People, they don't make things up. They tell us how they feel. And it's our job as scientists to understand, hey, maybe what's going on. One really interesting thing about the brain is the brain itself doesn't feel physical pain. So, if you get cut, right, it hurts on your leg, right? But the brain itself doesn't have the sensors that detect pain. And maybe a thing that people not everyone knows, because not everyone's a neuroscientist, is that if you ever go in for brain surgery, they'll give you a little bit of anesthetic on your scalp so that when they cut in, you don't feel it. But there's no anesthetic that's applied to the brain. Once they're in there, if they have to cut, if they have to remove a tumor, no anesthetic is necessary.
What?
And in many cases, yeah, it's astonishing. Your brain is full of neurons and nerves, but not the kind that detect pain. And in fact, in many of those situations, that surgery is actually done while you're wide awake, because the neurosurgeon wants to, if he's cutting a little bit of your brain, he wants you to talk and make sure that it's not part of the brain that helps you talk, for example.
Oh, God.
You won't feel a thing, right? As long as your scalp is numb up here, your skin would feel pain, but your brain doesn't. So if someone says, someone says, hey, this makes my brain hurt, right? This tragic event, or God, I've just been thinking so hard all day. What are they really saying? Well, we know already that people can take emotional events and refer to them as bodily pain. And again, I want to be crystal clear. I don't think they're making it up, right? I think that is the way they feel. People talk about a heartache, right? Well, why do they say they're heartaches? I don't know if their heart itself aches in a medical sense, but that sense of stress, that sense of trauma, it's causing activations in your nervous system up and down your body. And, you can refer to that feeling as a heartache very authentically. And I think people take that feeling and they can feel like they have a brain ache or their brain hurts in exactly the same way, whether it's the exhaustion from just a long cognitive day, right? We all did a lot and we thought a lot and we're tired, we're ready for the end of the day, my brain aches. But I think also that emotional pain can end up feeling that way as well. And, it's almost like, what's happening in our brain is we have all these neurochemicals, we have all this activation for these strong emotions that we're feeling, and it sort of needs to float around a little bit, and our body has to make some sense of, why am I feeling so disrupted? Why am I feeling upset or sad or confused or angry? And it decides that, well, some part of my body is hurting. That's why I feel this way.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. So I've had this experience. And again, I think many people have. Let's say you cut your finger and you're not even aware you cut your finger and you don't feel anything. But the second that you look at it and then you realize your finger is cut, now the finger hurts.
Yeah, that's right.
So
And
what is that?
well, this is probably the incredibly important role that attention has in binding all the events that happen together into a unified mental or brain concept. So, we don't notice things that we don't pay attention to, and there's a million experiments that show this, and we know this in our everyday life as well, right? I think all of us have. Oh, I don't know, maybe you were reading a book and, someone came up and said something and you just didn't notice it first because you were so focused on reading a book. What happens in the brain as that's occurring? Well, the information actually comes in through your ear, right? Has to. Your ear turns the sound into electrical impulses that gets sent up to your brain. So, the information gets to your brain. Why didn't you notice it? Well, it turns out that, our brain has these incredibly complex attention systems that help us focus on what we need to focus and help us ignore things we should be ignoring. And we would have to be that way. Can you imagine what your life would be like if, everything that happened was immediately capturing your attention? It would be a disaster. You'd never be able to get anything done.
Right. But so my question here, though, is if that information is still kind of coming in, is it possible that we can recall that information in a different way later, even though we didn't focus on it?
Absolutely. So, just briefly with regard to the story you said, hey, so I cut myself, that pain information is coming up to my brain, but because our attention is elsewhere, it just sort of stops at a certain point. And it's quite interesting from all the questions that we're talking about brain activation and conscious experience. You can clearly activate the brain, that pain information comes in, but you're not conscious of it. Now that's super interesting, right? Because what that tells us is that, hey, every time the brain gets activated, doesn't mean we're conscious of it. The brain and what we're conscious of are different in that sense. And so it becomes, there's some absolutely wild phenomenon around this. So there's a phenomenon called blind sight, for example. Have you come across that?
No.
So this is something that happens to people. It's rare, but happens after they've had a stroke that's damaging the early visual parts of their brain. And I'm putting my hand on the back of my head because, somewhat surprisingly, everything you see actually gets sent to the back of your brain, called the occipital lobe, and gets processed for vision. So let's say you have a stroke or a brain injury and you damage a lot of that part of the brain. Well, as you imagine, you don't see very well anymore, or perhaps you don't see anything. Again, your eyes work fine, but they're sending it up to the brain and there's nothing left there because you've had this damage. But lots of times, if you have some brain damage, the brain damage is not complete. There are little parts of the brain that are still working fine. And so scientists have done these experiments where, imagine you have this damage to the brain, you can't see, you're authentically blind. But nonetheless, scientists do weird things. So let's just show you a computer screen and we're going to flash some images on you. You're going to say you can't see any of them. And we're going to say, but that's fine. Just guess. Just guess. Tell us what you saw. Guess. Where did you see a light? I can't see it. That's fine. Just guess. So in many of these cases, people guess much better than pure luck. And if you use electrical imaging of the brain, you can see that little bits of the brain are turning on and it can guide action, right? They will guess correctly, but they have no conscious experience of seeing it. And what that tells us again is that we can drive brain activation, but it doesn't necessarily turn into conscious experience. And this goes down exactly the road you were laying out, because it raises all sorts of interesting questions. Well, could I learn something without ever being conscious of it?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the answer is absolutely yes. There's some fascinating psychological experiments where if you give people sequences that sort of seem random of like letters and other information, and you say, hey, just watch this, it's kind of random. And the person says it's random. Have you noticed any patterns? Nope, there are no patterns. Mm-hmm. Okay, but let me show you a B. What do you think is going to come next? How would I know what's going to come next? There are no patterns. Just guess. And it turns out that you can learn these very subtle associations without ever being aware that you're learning a rule, but you're going to guess what's going to come next if you've been exposed to it. So you can absolutely learn without conscious experience in that way. And, the more you go down this rabbit hole and you see how divorced brain activation can be from conscious experience, the more mysterious it really gets.
It's like never ending. It sounds like it's never ending.
That's exactly.
And then we have the
so much more to
subconscious.
figure out.
Yeah, right. And then the subconscious. And how do you even fit that into this conversation?
Yeah, of course, the subconscious was a topic that was originally raised by Freud as he was thinking about, this notion of things that you did that in his sense you weren't aware of. And a modern neuroscientist would sort of look at this, through a somewhat different lens. There are lots of things that we do that we don't necessarily have to be fully conscious of. I think everyone's had the experience of, hey, I drove over to my friend's house and I was thinking about work on the way, and you just like,
No idea how you got there.
Now, that's kind of amazing, right? Driving's a really complicated brain activity. You have to see all these things. You have to notice hazards. You got to make these man, can you really do all that without a conscious experience? And the answer is maybe kind of, actually.
You shouldn't, but you can.
You probably shouldn't. But, if something dramatic happened, it would probably wake up your consciousness, right? If you saw a dump truck coming into the intersection, you would instantly become alert and aware of that, and you would handle it. But you can probably get through a lot of sort of normal things without a deep conscious experience of it. And again, what does that tell you? I mean, as at the back of the early part of our conversation, we sort of raised this idea, do we need consciousness? Mm-hmm. And you think about driving to your friend's house, and maybe not, right? I mean, we can do complex actions without really feeling like we're particularly aware of them or particularly storing them in memory one way or the other. Why, from an evolutionary perspective, why did we end up with a conscious experience? It's not at all obvious how it's useful to us from an evolutionary perspective.
That's so fascinating. Well, I want to get, before I ask more esoteric questions that aren't esoteric to you at all, I'm sure.
I was going to say, these are pretty esoteric already. You're on a great...
Are they? Okay. Well, I want to talk about your BrainHQ, the program that that you created. Is that the right word?
Yeah. The team of people at Posit Science, the neuroscientists, the game designers, we all work together to build this program. You're exactly right.
Okay. So there's BrainHQ that is meant to help us exercise our brain to help us have better memory, sharper skills, more focus, peace of mind. I don't know. You tell me. And just different sensory experiences in our brain. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. This comes from this idea of brain plasticity. And, I've been talking a lot about how the brain works, but, actually one of the most important ways the brain works is that it is constantly rewiring and changing itself. And that's kind of a new idea. If you were to recycle the clock back to, let's say, 1970, and you were to ask any neuroscientist, how does the brain work? Every one of them would have said the same thing. They would say, hey, the brain's like a computer chip inside your head. And, it made sense, right? It's got wires, which we call neurons, carries electricity, it clearly processes information, seems exactly like a computer chip. But that led to some very wrong ideas, right? And one important thing about computer chips is they're basically hardwired, right? And they could break, right? We've all dropped a laptop. We've all had a computer wear out over time. And we thought that's how our brains work too. We thought, hey, as we get older, it just wears out. There's nothing you can really do about it. We're all going to slow down and lose our memories as we get older. Too bad. And hey, if you have a brain injury, there's not a lot that you're going to do to get better at it. When I went to graduate school in the 90s, I was taught at the beginning of graduate school that, hey, every day that you get older, a few more neurons die and they're not coming back.
Wow. And also, what about people who do drugs? That whole information
right.
there.
That's right. That's why my parents told me not to do drugs.
Right.
They kill those neurons and they're not coming back. Right. I'll have to tell you, because I know you and your audience reach these things. I had a very close friend in graduate school who said, yeah, but what if we kill the neurons that make you unhappy? Maybe that's
there you go.
So that was a very fun line of thought. But that all changed, right? In the 80s and the 90s, it became clear that the brain's in no way a computer chip. And Leah, I hope if you and your listeners walk away with anything from this conversation, it's that notion. The brain's not a computer chip. Our brains are not hardwired. Our brains constantly rebuild and reorganize and rewire themselves in response to what we ask them to do, what we learn, our experiences in the world. And that's true when we're a baby, but it's also true when we're a young adult. It's true when we're an older adult. built. And frankly, it's true if our brains are healthy and if our brains are unhealthy. It's just how the brain works. It's constantly changing and reorganizing. And so we started this company, Posit Science, and we built these brain training exercises, BrainHQ, because my PhD advisor called me up after I'd finished graduate school, and he said, "Hey, we've been studying brain plasticity for a while. We've rewired a lot of rat brains to make healthier rat brains. We've rewired a lot of monkey brains to make healthier monkey brains. Why don't we rewire some human brains, make some healthier human brains?" And that was a pretty good pitch. So I came and joined the company as it started. But that was exactly our goal. We said, look, we understand a lot about brain plasticity. We can build science-based brain exercises that you do on a computer, your laptop, or your phone, or a tablet, and they quite literally rewire the brain to make it faster and more accurate. And if you have a faster, more accurate brain, well, you should have better memory, better speed, better attention. But you should also have a more resilient brain that's going to, maybe help you bounce back from a depressive symptom more quickly. Have a more resilient brain that means, hey, as you get older, you can have your brain last as long as your body, which I think is most of our goals as we get older, and maybe even put off things like dementia.
Well, I was going to ask, so are things like dementia or Alzheimer's or some of these neurological issues, are they in fact then genetic primarily, or is this something else going on? And can we avoid it with these exercises?
They're really not genetic primarily. You will hear from time to time about Alzheimer's genes. There's a very famous one called ApoE4, for example, that conveys some additional risk to Alzheimer's. But at the margin, they might make you a little more likely or a little less likely to get Alzheimer's, but it's not a primarily genetic disease.
Interesting.
And, that's raised tons of questions over the past really 40 or 50 years at this point. Well, what is Alzheimer's? And there's been this kind of back and forth in the field. Some people have argued, well, look, Alzheimer's is inevitable. The only reason you don't get Alzheimer's is you die too soon. If we all lived forever, we would get Alzheimer's is brain aging, has been one view. The other view has been, hey, Alzheimer's is not brain aging. Alzheimer's is a particular specific medical condition that it represents something abnormal that has happened to your brain. And if we can figure out what is that abnormal thing, then, hey, maybe we can develop a drug or a device or what have you to fight it. And what's amazing is that TikTok between those two positions has gone back and forth. And the very sad state of Alzheimer's research, as you probably know, is that we haven't had a new drug to treat Alzheimer's in the past 20 years. And the drugs that we have already are, they're not that great. I mean, maybe they're a little better than nothing, but you're not going to talk to a doctor who thinks the existing drugs are great. And you may have followed the news about a recent drug that was approved, but then in the end, Medicare said they wouldn't pay for it because, hey, in the end, it didn't really look that effective. And so what does that tell us about Alzheimer's disease? It probably tells us that Alzheimer's is not like what's a disease we can cure with a drug? Like, if you've got tuberculosis, you have a bacterial infection in your lungs, like you can take an antibiotic and it will go away. You will get better, right? That's because the single cause of tuberculosis is the antibiotic, the medicine cures it. Alzheimer's really doesn't look like that at this point. It does not look like we're going to find a single wonder drug that's going to reverse or arrest the effects of Alzheimer's. And in fact, the more we look at Alzheimer's, well, what do we learn? Well, we learn that people who live what you might call a brain healthier lifestyle are less likely to get Alzheimer's. So people who eat a brain healthy diet, which is basically the Mediterranean diet, plus more green vegetables and more berries, they actually seem like they get Alzheimer's at a lower rate. People who exercise regularly seem to get Alzheimer's at a lower rate. Well, what does exercise have to do with the brain? That's kind of interesting and surprising, right? People, if you sleep worse, you're more likely to experience cognitive decline and probably go on to Alzheimer's. If you're socially isolated, right? You're living alone on your home, you don't really see your friends or your family, you're very much more likely to go on to Alzheimer's than someone who has a rich social life. Now, these are all things that tell us that this is pretty different than tuberculosis. And, what they tell us is that there's an underlying science of how to make a brain healthy, or sadly, how to make a brain unhealthy. And that, in the end, is what's going to contribute to going on to something like Alzheimer's over time.
Interesting. So fascinating. Well, to get back to something you just referred to about the brain being resilient, rewiring constantly. In my work, we talk a lot about emotional healing, mindfulness, and spirituality and so forth. And in those conversations, trauma comes up a lot. And
Yeah.
now I think there's more and more people bringing trauma to light, PTSD outside of war conditions and certain things, personal issues. So I'm curious if trauma brain or PTSD or CPTSD can be also, if this sounds like very positive information for those people who are suffering ongoingly with the story and the triggers and the fears.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a couple ways to look at PTSD from this kind of neuroscience perspective, you know? So one important thing that the front part of our brain does up here, I'll use my hands again, is it governs what we think of as set shifting or framing or responding kind of to the context of things that happen around us. And we think about PTSD, we think about, a traumatic event that happened that captures our attention. And once our brain is starting to think about it, we can't shift our brain's thinking away from it. And so we're reliving this stress and trauma. And of course, reliving stress and trauma is almost as bad as experiencing it for the first time. And, in that sense, it's very bad for the brain, right? It's bad for cognitive function and creates mood disorders, probably increases the risk of Alzheimer's disease. But if we recognize that the brain is plastic and can rewire itself, you can then ask the question, well, could we rewire the brain so that when an intrusive thought or when a trigger of a PTSD sort of event occurs, that we rewire our brain to, shunt it aside or simply not let it capture our attention? We talked a moment ago about, hey, if you get a cut on your finger, you might not notice it. Can we imagine rewiring someone's brain so that when that trigger event for PTSD happens, they just don't notice it in the same way that you might, ignore a cut on your finger or drive to your friend's house without noticing it? And, I'm confident the answer is yes. And, all of the things that you just talked about around psychotherapy and mindfulness and trauma therapy, these are all ways that we've developed, without a good understanding of neuroscience, and that's okay. Not everything has to be about neuroscience.
Yeah.
That we've developed to rewire the brain so that we can, process these events around PTSD differently. And hey, different people are different. Some people want to process them by ignoring the trigger. Some people want to process them by seeing them through to the end and then recognizing they don't have to be stressed by this. Different people are different, but all that represents rewiring of the brain. So, if we look at people who have depressive disorder, I mentioned psychotherapy and talk therapy, but just to be super clear, scientists have done brain imaging experiments, right? And they've seen quite clearly that people who go through talk therapy with depression experience physical structural changes to the brain by going through and talking about that. And I'm confident the same thing is true for these kinds of PTSD treatments, which is if a person can go through that kind of therapy and start to experience some resolution, we're going to see that in the wiring of the brain. They have rewired their own brain as a result of that that therapy, that training, that trauma processing. What I, would love to see neuroscience start to contribute to this is, hey, can we make that faster? Can we make it more durable? Can we identify somewhat better, hey, which people are going to benefit from this kind of therapy and which people are going to benefit from that kind of therapy? If we can bring that science of brain plasticity to it, then, I think we might be able to supercharge some of these therapies.
Well, yeah. So I was going to ask, and because there seems to be a separation of still, which makes sense in a certain way, but some of the techniques like EMDR or neurofeedback or even meditation, or as you mentioned, psychotherapy, psychedelics, so many different things that people are using now. Is there a neuroscience influence in these things, or is it kind of still two different worlds?
We would love to see more. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
I mean, so much of neuroscience still represents a basic science. And I think one of the things that was very exciting for me when my PhD advisor, Mike Mersnick, founded Posit Science is, hey, he's an applied science guy. He just, he had been studying brain plasticity for 20 years and 30 years, and he just wasn't going to be satisfied by publishing scientific papers and getting tenure. He was only going to be satisfied by bringing this out into the world in BrainHQ and helping people. And I frankly just think we need a little bit more of that entrepreneurial spirit in our basic scientists.
Okay. So you're not opposed to those other therapies. There's just not a lot of integration. Is that right?
No, I'm not opposed at all. If another lens in how I would describe myself, some days I describe myself as a neuroscientist, and some days I would say I'm a clinical trialist. I'm a
Mm,
person who's very focused on, hey, let's design great, rigorous clinical trials that help us understand which therapies work and which don't, but maybe put a bit better, which therapies work in which ways for which people, which they could be most helpful.
okay. Yeah.
Some of the therapies that, let's put it this way. I think there's an enormous tragedy when a therapy doesn't have a good evidentiary base. And it's a tragedy because on the one hand, hey, maybe people are spending time and money on something that's not helpful. Nobody wants to see that. But on the other hand, hey, maybe the therapy actually, can help a lot of people, but because we haven't done good clinical trials yet,
Right.
we don't know, is it going to help you or is it going to help me? Which one of us should get it? And that's also a tragedy because there's a missed opportunity.
Yeah.
I mean, you know how things are in this country. We spend hundreds of billions of dollars on drug trials, and we
Mhm.
do not spend hundreds of billions
Right.
of dollars on trials of whether it's cognitive training or whether it's
Right.
PTSD therapy. I mean, the mismatch between, just to go back to PTSD, as you mentioned, the mismatch between the amount that we would spend on a drug trial versus the paucity of funds that are available for good clinical trials for advancing, behavioral or, any one of the other number of techniques you mentioned in PTSD. I mean, it's just mind blowing that there's so much money on the one side and so little money on the other.
Yeah. So little. Well, I have a kind of a different kind of question. This is
Sure.
purely coming from my own curiosity, but I'd love to have your input. What is deja vu?
What is deja vu? Oh, there's a lot of really interesting things to say about deja vu.
I can only imagine, and we don't have time to go into all of it today, but I want to hear at least some kind of nugget of wisdom from you about what this is.
Let me say two things that might be related to deja vu. Let's put it
Okay.
that way. So, as you know, deja vu is the experience of you come in and to a situation that should be new, but instead you feel a sense of familiarity with it.
Yes.
Where can that come
Or
from?
memory, even
A
sometimes.
memory even of it, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
Okay, so here's two ideas that might be related. So, and they're all going to sound far out at first, but I'll
Hey,
try.
that's good.
So the first is phantom limb syndrome. So as you may know, a person who loses a limb in an accident or in a war, the arm is gone, for example, but the part of the brain that used to receive sensation from the arm, the part of the brain that used to send motor commands to the arm is still there. And
Mhm.
so you might ask, well, what happens to that part of the brain? Well, it just sits there thinking there's an arm there still. How would the brain know? And so many people report that, hey, I still feel my arm, even though it's not there. And that's because the brain is, let's say my arm is gone here. If I get a little tickle, what's here, my brain is going to process that as maybe from my missing fingers. This is called phantom limb syndrome. And in many people, it's quite painful and quite distressing.
Yes.
But that's why it exists. So now I'm going to say, why do people believe in ghosts? So there's a fascinating neuroscientific theory out there that says that, hey, ghosts are like phantom limbs of people. Now, let's say there's been a person you've known your whole life, your mom, let's just pick as an example, right? And she passes away at some point, very sadly. There's a lot of parts of your brain that are used to processing your mom, right? You have parts of your brain that respond to her face and the sound of her voice and maybe the smell of her perfume and the feeling you had when you saw her at your house. All those little parts of your brain are still there, even though your mom is gone. Just like all those little parts of your brain are still here, even though your limb is gone. So now anything that activates that little part of your brain, it's going to actually feel like your mom. Just like anything that activates the little part of your brain is going to feel like your arm if you have a phantom limb. So I think there's been some very interesting thinking around neuroscientists to say, look, if a person says they've seen a ghost, I mean, not like a Hollywood ghost, right? But they've seen a ghost, right? I saw my mom, even though she
Mhm.
passed away 5 years ago. Probably that's going on. There's, from a neuroscience perspective, there's a little bit of activation of something that triggered that little part of your brain. And when that part of your brain turns on, you feel like you've seen your mom. So how does that relate to deja vu? Well, the deja vu is that sense of, hey, I have seen this before, even though you shouldn't have. And maybe what's going on is you've been in a situation that is, somewhat related and kind of overlapping, but not identical,
Mhm.
similar enough that when you see it, it triggers that activation of that other memory, but your mind doesn't quite realize it's another memory. It places it where you are right now. And so you're left with that sense of familiarity, just like seeing something reminded you of your mom, or being touched on your arm activated that sense of your arm, you're left with that sense of familiarity, even though you don't quite deserve it in some sense because you haven't. So that's one idea.
Okay.
There's another slightly fascinating one. There's a wonderful neuroscientist where I did my graduate work who passed away right as I was a young scientist, named Benjamin Libet. And at the University of California, San Francisco, he studied something called backwards referencing in time. So Benjamin Libet was really interested in the relationship between the brain and the conscious experience. And he did this very complicated sense of experiments, but in the end, what people were doing was they were watching like a stopwatch go around, and he would ask them just spontaneously to tap a finger at certain points. And what he was able to figure out is that he could see brain activation that indicated the person was going to tap their finger before the person said, "I've decided to tap my finger." And so the way Ben Libet interpreted that was, hey, your brain decides to tap the finger, and then your conscious experience says, "Oh, I'm about to tap my finger." And then your conscious experience says, "I'm in charge of tapping my finger, so I'm making the decision," right? And so he called this backwards referencing in time, because he felt like the decision to tap your finger got moved backwards in time before your brain actually started to tap your finger. And that's why your conscious mind believes it's in control, even though the brain is actually the one that's in control. So, hey, there's been some back and forth. Maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong. But when I think about deja vu, here's an experience that's happened to me, speaking very personally, that makes me think about this. Sometimes I'm in the car and I'm listening to the radio, and I have a very distinct sensation that I think this song is going to play, and then it starts to play, right? Now, I don't think I'm precognitive particularly. I really don't. But I do think that what can happen is that my brain hears the first little bit of a song that I know really well, and then it recognizes it. And then my brain pushes that point of recognition to before the song began, right? My brain reorders these events in time.
Oh, wow.
And that makes me feel like I noticed it before it started to play, even though I noticed it after it started to play. It's like a bit of accuracy in your temporal precision.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And so when I think about deja vu, I wonder if maybe that's a little bit of that going on. You come into a situation, you become familiar with it, quickly, and then your brain kind of reorders this in time. And it instead of thinking, well, I just got here and I now feel familiar with it, your brain swaps those up a little bit and says, oh, where's this feeling of familiarity come from? And sort of moves it around in time. And that's what gives you this disjointed sense of what's going on. All that being said, we don't know, as you can clearly tell from my odd examples, and it's a fascinating phenomenon. But I think this is one of the ways that over time, neuroscientists, psychologists, humanists of all sorts, philosophers, I think we're going to start to unpack these issues of the brain and conscious experience by studying these weird little disjointed events.
Yeah.
And that's going to give us deeper insight into who we are and how our brains work and what it means to be a conscious person. So
it's very exciting. Well, I have two more questions for you. Actually,
Sure.
One of them is a very personal experience of mine, which I'll share because I don't really know how it works, and it doesn't matter, I suppose. But in my work with clients one-on-one, people would call me intuitive. I see what's going on in their brain and from their brain in the past, or different connections. And I see it like images, and I know a lot of people have talked about clairvoyance, clairaudience, or, different types of seeing this. But what is actually going on? Do you know in the brain?
Well, some people would call it intuition, and other people would call it wisdom. So when I think of intuition, generally what I think of is someone who's actually extremely experienced in a field, who in that subconscious way we talked about, without conscious experience, without feeling like they need to open up a rule book and follow it, they've seen a pattern so many times that they know where the situation is going to lead to just through that experience. So what would be a good example? Think about someone who's a world-class piano player, right? And you and I'm not a world-class piano player. I don't know if you are. Probably not. Okay. We
Although
might be.
I have a beautiful piano here.
You do have a gorgeous piano. Well, I like to plonk a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay. We could be at a concert and we're seeing, Van Cliburn playing, right? Some amazing pianists. And he is doing that automatically and to some extent unconsciously. and to some extent intuitively, right? He plays a certain bit of a melody, he intuits where that's going to go next. I don't think that's magic particularly. I
No.
think that he has done it so many times and he's done so many variations of it that his brain knows, well, if I play these notes, most likely it's going to go here next. I think you're probably the same way with your clients. I've just met you today, but my guess is you've had a lot of experience talking to people in a lot of challenging situations, and you've very often seen, well, if A and B happen, C is what's going to happen next in a person's life. I think of that as intuition. You didn't need to write down that A and B leads to C, but you've seen it so many times that when you hear a person speak in a certain way or act in a certain way, your brain very quickly, automatically, subconsciously goes to, hey, what's going to happen next with this person, or what's likely going to be helpful. And so that's what I think of intuition as, built up wisdom, frankly, through a tremendous amount of experience.
Right. Yeah. I agree.
Experience?
Well, that's part of what I experienced, certainly, because of I agree with everything you're saying. But I think that other piece of the seeingness, like, for example, if I'm in a session, I go into a certain mental state, a relaxed kind of mental state. And to be able to see someone's father, like the image of their father without ever having seen their father before, or information that's presented through that father, to this person that makes sense to them. I have no idea. So I'm just curious. And when we're talking about the brain and consciousness, or even intuition and wisdom, is that coming from the brain itself, or is it coming from that other state of the mind that we're not sure of?
It is a great question. It is a great question. I am still of generally the belief that the skill that a person like you has developed over time is you're able to, hear what your client is talking about. You're able to combine this with your experience, wisdom, and your creativity. And, that creates an image, like you said, or an experience like that. And you're able to play that back to someone in, in a compelling way that they then recognize the parts of it that seem right to them. And, lots of people are really good at this, right? And I have no qualm with any of them, right? If you, I read what's a better example? It's a learned skill, I guess, is what I would put it that way.
I would agree. Yeah.
That being said, and here I'll go out a little bit farther out on a limb that most of my neuroscientific colleagues would.
Okay.
But I'll say it anyway, because this is an enjoyable, for having a nice time in this conversation, I hope.
Okay.
If we believe that the brain creates the mind, it's not out of the question that minds could interact in some way. I have to believe. I really do. I think it's I wouldn't, I generally am not going to call I'm a scientist. I'm not going to call something a psychic phenomenon exactly. And I believe that if it's true, we should be able to study it scientifically. And I'm quite interested. I said I was a clinical trialist. I'm quite interested in, over time, of, proper clinical trials, proper scientific investigations of these kinds of phenomenon. I wouldn't say it's, I think there's some scientists who are like, hey, that's just outside the realm of anything reasonable. We shouldn't investigate it. And I'm not one. I'm absolutely not one. These phenomena are repeatable enough and people comment on them enough, and we don't know enough about the mind and the brain to rule them out. So
well, thank you. Thank you for adding that. Yeah. And
I really do believe that.
Yeah. And my final question for you with your BrainHQ, but also just in your personal life, you are obviously a very intelligent person with a lot of information, but you also have a tremendous recall, it seems, in titles, words, and I know you studied this for many years, but what do you do to keep your brain healthy, sharp, active? And if you don't mind sharing, what are some of your challenges in those ways, so that we don't see someone like you as a god, but as a person?
I way often think about this, because we think about brain plasticity a lot. Is, you've probably heard the phrase, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. And I think that's exactly backwards. I think that when you stop learning new tricks, you become an old dog. And it's really important for all of us at every phase of our life to live a life that is, filled with new learning and curiosity and new experiences. And, speaking personally, the fear I would have mostly of my own life is that, hey, just sort of settle into a rut of kind of the same thing over and over again. We know that when the brain gets into a rut is when it loses its resilience and its potency and its creativity and so forth. So, in my own life, well, I am on the team that built BrainHQ. I'm an avid BrainHQ user. I could notice the difference in my own life in terms of being sharper and faster as a result of doing BrainHQ training. But I try my best to live a life where, new learning and novelty and new experiences happen. My wife and I love to travel. Nothing that we love better than going to a new city and sort of being lost in it, right?
Yeah.
And, that can be a distressing experience, right? I'm out of my comfort zone. I don't know where to go. But with a certain amount of safety net underneath you, right? We'll always have a credit card.
Right.
Learning how to buy groceries in a new city, learning how to find the best ice cream shop, right? That kind of new learning is very stimulating and healthy for the brain. My son left for college a few years ago, as I may have mentioned, and I had some more free time on my hands, and I've started to learn to play a musical instrument. I'm actually taking lessons, and I'm not a musician, I'm by any stretch of the imagination, but I can feel my brain and my mind working so differently
Right.
when I'm learning something. It's way outside of my comfort zone like that, and I know that's good for my brain, and it's fun, and I enjoy it too. And so that would be my advice to anyone. Of course, you're always going to hear me recommending BrainHQ, but I think I would also say, we just want to, whoever we are, and every person is different, find something that we are curious about, excited about, passionate about, always wanted to try at some point in our life. And, get out of your comfort zone and learn it or try it or take a lesson or go somewhere, because that new experience, that change, rewiring the brain, that's what makes a brain healthy. That's what keeps a dog young, is those ability to keep learning new tricks like that.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. And thank you for your time and all of your wisdom and knowledge, sharing it with us. For everyone listening or watching, you can go to BrainHQ. Does that have its own website, BrainHQ?
Yeah, it's just www.brainhq.com. But if you type BrainHQ into your browser, you'll find it. And hey, if you're curious to try these exercises, the great news is that anyone can register, and it will give you one per day just for free to see if you like them or not. And then if it's something where you're like, hey, this would help me have a faster, better brain, and that's something I'd benefit, then hey, you should subscribe. It's cheap, and we have wonderful help, and we'd love to have people joining our brain training community. So thanks.
That's great. Thanks so much. And to all the listeners, we will see you next week on the Modern Sage podcast.